conditions to the treaty. That will be a CBM short of the ratification. Because the Iranians always take the stand that this is very high profile and they need the Majlis to approve or that, that is a very minor kind of bureaucratic thing to do. With the other party, the other two, Pakistan and India, true that they have committed themselves to moratorium, but I think a step in the right direction, other than exceeding, is for them to accept the establishment of stations on their territory. Now, all the 5 signatories, the earlier one, the signatories, they all have stations, one way or another, radionuclide, infrared, seismic, and whatnot, especially China and the United States. For Pakistan and India, to show an additional CBM is to welcome the establishment of these stations. The other point that I would like to address, and that is the habit in our region and in others, but I see it, I'm speaking from the region, and that is we tend to link the being party to a treaty to that of another country. For example, Egypt makes its ratification that it should hinge on that of Israel, Iran on India, India looks China or the United States, and I think that is one thing that we should address, and that is the question of perceptions. Why do we have to keep on this issue of conditionality? I will only if the other party does that. We'll have to find a mindset that will de-link these issues. And as I said, earlier, the question of testing is not really that important or practical or of an added value. And in the case of Iran in particular, this is now inconceivable given its commitment to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. But I want to take the opportunity now just to address, I have time, to address another point of a more salient CBM for my region, and that is the Safety Convention. For me, as a member, as a Kuwaiti from the Gulf region, I think more important than the Test Ban Treaty is the Safety Convention. And here I think, this is addressed primarily to our neighbor across the Gulf, and that is Iran, because the other two have already committed themselves to it. India was one of the latecomers, I think it was in 2005. It will go a long way to allay the concerns of the region. I know that the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action addresses the question of safety at length, but we are dealing here not only with conventions, we are dealing also with perceptions of the public. How does it view it, And this will be the rightful approach, I think, if Iran will go ahead and accede to that convention. The ratification by Israel and Egypt to the Safety Convention will be also a step in the right direction. I'm dressing, now in this totality, that of Iran to be there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Benjamin. It's a great privilege to participate on this panel, although I should note that I don't consider myself an expert either on the region or, for that matter, on the topic of the CTBT, but I have had the opportunity this past spring and summer to participate in several CTBT activities related to the panel theme, and I'm delighted to have the opportunity to share with you some of my thoughts. I'm a little bit embarrassed because I think the only other time I really spoke formally on this subject was in Korea, where Hans Blix was very prominent, and so he already knows what I'm about to say, And if they're very difficult questions, I'm going to turn to Hans to respond. In the 10 minutes that I have allotted to me, what I'd like to try to do is to explain why I believe the most likely next Annex II states to ratify the CTBT will be from the Middle East, and what the major considerations are likely to be for those states. And if time permits, I also may raise the issue of the potential linkage between Indian pursuit of membership in the Nuclear Suppliers Group and its support for the CTBT. And let me start with Israel and the CTBT. And I would begin by saying that the more that I explore the issue, the more I'm convinced that Executive Secretary Lassina Zerbo is correct to identify Israel as the most likely next Annex II state to ratify the Test Ban Treaty. I also would argue that the time frame for such action need not be too distant. Moreover, I'm increasingly persuaded that there are a number of mistaken impressions about Israeli perspective. So let me touch on several of those misconceptions. First of all, there's a widely held, but I believe mistaken view that Israeli ratification of the CTBT must follow U.S. ratification. The Israeli government, as best I can tell, does not subscribe to that view. Indeed, not only is it unhelpful to posit that the U.S. must sign before Israel will do so, but I would argue the reverse may well be the case, or at least at a minimum, Israeli ratification may provide a much-needed boost to efforts to secure the necessary vote count in the U.S., and we may want to return to that argument later, particularly in light of the recent emphasis given by Secretary Kerry to the importance of concluding a CTBT as soon as possible. A second misconception is a confusion between conditions and considerations. I'm persuaded, after extended discussions with senior Israeli atomic energy and MFA officials, as well as in light of recent statements made by Israeli officials, including at the First Committee last week, that Israel has not set any formal preconditions for its ratification of the CTBT, although I acknowledge on occasion officials do send mixed messages on this point. However, there are several important considerations which almost certainly will influence Israel's ratification decision, and here it's important to note that Israel continues to insist that it's not a question of if it will ratify, but rather when it will ratify. Moreover, it's conceivable that a decision to ratify could be made before any or all of its considerations have been addressed. So what then are the important considerations from an Israeli perspective? In my view, they pertain first to past violation by states in the Middle East of other treaties to which they have been parties. Secondly, a robust but still incomplete verification regime. And thirdly, and I think in some ways most interestingly, political impediments to participating on an equal basis in the policy-making organs of the CTBTO due to opposition by some members of the Middle East and South Asia, that is the MESA group, who refuse to recognize Israel as a state. There is a surprising dearth of analysis on these issues and on other impediments, including the potential misuse of inspections and how they can be overcome. For the moment, however, I only want to say a little bit more about the issue of MESA and the CTBTO, about which little has been written and appears to be poorly understood even among many of the 26 members of the MESA regional group. You all get a particular bonus, special bonus, if you can identify probably even two-thirds of that grouping. Among the relevant points I would make are, one, the CTBT is unique in that it is the only international treaty that specifies the members of different regional groups, including MESA. That's part of the text of the treaty. Secondly, when Israel participated in the negotiation of the CTBT, a key consideration was to ensure Israel's ability to serve as an equal member of the treaty's policymaking organs, a stance informed by the lack of such standing at the IAEA Board of Governors. Thirdly, Israel identifies, and I'm choosing my words carefully here, movement on Mesa, not resolution of the problem, as an important consideration related to ratification, as it wants to have the opportunity to participate in leadership positions on the CTBTO working groups A and B, which are based on group membership. As I understand it, Israel is fine with selection of candidates from different regions, but is opposed to rotation on a geographical basis in which Mesa is never included. Now, although Iran and a number of Arab states have opposed Israeli participation in Mesa, there are some key members of the Mesa group that appear not to be opposed, and in fact could act to jumpstart Mesa. I would suggest that those countries include Kazakhstan and Sri Lanka, as well as 3 other Central Asian states, and probably also Jordan and the UAE, although I let their representatives who may be in the room here speak to that matter on their own. Israel would be happy if one of these states in a position to do so simply called a meeting at which those countries who were so inclined would attend. For example, it's my understanding that in principle Kazakhstan, in its co-chairmanship position with Japan for the last Article 14 conference held this past September, might have sought to convene a meeting of the Mesa group. In any case, I would argue more research is needed to better understand the politics of Mesa and to explore steps that might produce some movement with respect to that regional group. So let me now turn to Iran. I do so with a little bit of trepidation, seeing Ali Sultani here. We already had a preliminary discussion on my views on this topic. I can say that we're not in perfect agreement, but I'm sure Ali will have something to say, but nevertheless I'll proceed as I had planned. It remains to be seen how the Iran nuclear deal will be implemented. Nevertheless, in my view, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action has the potential to have much more immediate impact on the nuclear programs of states in the region than would simply convening a WMD-free zone conference, something that now more than ever seems unlikely to occur anytime soon. Indeed, the JCPOA has the potential, in my view, to be a game changer in the region and could have a very positive impact on the peace process and U.S.-Iranian relations more generally. The nuclear deal, however, could also provide additional incentives for some states of the region to accelerate their inchoate nuclear programs, and steps, I would argue, will need to be taken to minimize that development. One important potential approach would be to direct much more attention than has been the case to date on the important role the CTBT could play in promoting confidence and stability in a regional context. For example, it would be timely to revisit the objections Iran has expressed in the past about the CTBT and not simply to repeat the refrain, the time is not ripe. Thus, although Iran routinely expresses support for the CTBT and the activities of the Provisional Technical Secretariat, it has identified a number of impediments to the treaty's entry into force. These pertain to regional issues, failure of the U.S. to ratify the treaty, and perceived shortcomings related to current nuclear disarmament efforts. In my view, the comprehensive nuclear deal should reduce some of those obstacles, especially with respect to U.S.-Iranian relations. There's an urgency, in my mind, therefore, for the NGO and academic communities to consider how to promote the view that ratification of the treaty would be a useful means to demonstrate Iran's commitment to peaceful nuclear energy use. Even if the treaty's ratification at an early date is unlikely, it may be possible to build on a nuclear deal for the purpose of reversing the 2007 decision to suspend data transmission from the IMS stations on Iranian territory, 3 of which have been built and connected to the IDC. One also might gain approval for the construction of 2 planned infrasound and radionuclide stations in Tehran, which have not yet been built. And I would note parenthetically that while some attention has been given to the manner in which the failure to convene Mesa is an impediment to Israeli ratification, it also was likely to complicate Iranian ratification, as Iran is a member of the Mesa regional group as well and will not be able to hold an office unless Mesa begins to function. which in turn would mean accepting Israeli participation. This dilemma points to the need, in my mind, to look much more carefully about how to stand up MESA, something that is simply outside of the purview of most diplomats and also most academics who are interested in the CTBTO. So let me conclude with just a few words on the third topic that I said I would try to touch upon, and that's India and the CTBT. If Israel and Iran are the two relatively, and I emphasize relatively, easy CTBT nuts to crack, the third eye, India, is a much more remote possibility for forward movement on the CTBT front. Indeed, India not only has rejected any overtures from the CTBTO, it even has refused to provide a visa to its executive secretary to visit the country, which is a story in and of itself. Hans may want to say more. I'm not going to say more right at the moment. While I remain very skeptical that India will demonstrate new flexibility regarding the CTBT, I believe it makes sense to explore possible linkage between Indian pursuit of NSG membership and support for the CTBT. India has frequently indicated that while it's prepared to maintain a voluntary moratorium as long as it does not impinge on its national security, there is no question of its signing the CTBT. That being said, India also is actively seeking membership in the NSG, entry to which would require consensus among existing NSG members. A number of current NSG members are skeptical, as am I, about the wisdom of admitting a non-NPT state party and one that possesses nuclear weapons, especially as membership by India would, for all practical purposes, forever preclude Pakistani membership. Although many non-governmental analysts also have raised sound non-proliferation reasons for opposing Indian membership, the U.S., other Western NSG members, and Russia support Indian membership, albeit with different levels of enthusiasm. Some, for example, believe that membership should be tied to Indian pledges to adopt various non-proliferation and disarmament measures, including the FMCT and the CTBT. In light of this debate, I think there may be an opportunity for CTBTO advocates to promote CTBT ratification by India, although they would first want to assess carefully the non-proliferation costs and benefits of such a conditional arrangement. So why don't I stop there and look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Bill. I don't know, Manfred, if you will jump into that argument just now, but it was at the same time broad-minded presentation and very specific. Manfred, you have the floor for the Southeast Asia issue.
South Asia.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, everyone. It really is a privilege and a pleasure to have this opportunity of addressing you at the EU Consortium. I am grateful to Mark for inviting me here and to Matt for making this possible. I will come to the issues that Dr. Potter raised, but let me say my piece first. And I'm going to be extremely candid in making a confession, which should surprise you. The CTBT is not a very popular treaty in India. And this is ironical because India was amongst one of the most vocal supporters of a test ban. It continues to maintain that the test ban should be a step that should be leading you towards disarmament. And that's exactly how India had looked at the entire concept of a test ban, a CTBT, that would lead you from non-proliferation to disarmament. And in that sense, if it had evolved in the manner that India was wanting it to, what we would be talking about today would not be a regional CBM, but a global CBM, because that's exactly what the CTBT was meant to do, to provide a means by which the non-nuclear weapon states would not acquire nuclear weapons because testing would be foreclosed. That option would not be available to the non-nuclear weapon states. And the nuclear weapon states would also commit to not undertaking any refinement or modernization of their arsenal. So the horizontal and the vertical proliferation would be taken care of, leading to an obsolescence about nuclear weapons and eventual elimination of nuclear weapons. Therefore, it was to be a global CBM, a confidence reassurance mechanism between the nuclear weapon states and the non-nuclear weapon states. And you all are extremely knowledgeable people who know very well what the history of the CTBT was and how it evolved. Unfortunately, it did not evolve the way that India had wanted it to. Rather, the CTBT invoked no linkage between the elimination of nuclear weapons in any realistic time frame, and rather restricted the scope of nuclear weapons testing to banning only explosive testing, allowing the nuclear weapon states that had the capability to carry on with simulations or subcritical testing. So therefore, it was not testing per se that was being banned by the CTBT, but a certain kind of explosive testing. Such an approach gave special rights to the nuclear weapon states. And with India having its problems with China, which are not just border problems, but there are much larger territorial issues that are yet unresolved between India and China. With China being a nuclear weapon state that had the right to carry on with its refinement of its nuclear arsenal, you can well understand that the CTBT, the way it was evolving, was not addressing India's security concerns. And to further complicate the matter came the unprecedented and, dare I say, illegal entry into force clause that was clearly perceived by India as a pressure tactic, because this went against the Vienna Convention, where it was forcing a country without its consent to mandatorily be a part of the treaty for it to enter into force. Now, all of this compelled India to reject the CTBT in 1996, despite believing in the principle of no testing, which it still continues to believe, as a disarmament measure rather than just a non-proliferation measure. Now, you're all familiar with the current Indian position on the CTBT. It has also been mentioned that there is a unilateral moratorium in place. Successive Indian prime ministers from 1998 have, and also in the context of the Indo-US nuclear deal, have said that the unilateral moratorium will stay and that India will not stand in the way of entry into force of the CTBT, but it will not be the first one to enter into the treaty either. Now, in the absence of any moves by several of the major CTBT holdouts, and in fact at a time when we see an overall increase in the salience of nuclear weapons, we had an entire session that was dedicated to that whole concept of how the importance of nuclear weapons in national security strategies is going up. In view of the fact that China is undertaking a modernization, a strategic modernization of its conventional and nuclear capability, more and more blatant nuclear brinksmanship by Pakistan, I don't see any desire in India to open up the issue of the CTBT. There's a whole domestic background that comes to the CTBT, and we can talk about it if anyone's interested. But in this context that we see evolving globally and in the region, given India's security concerns from both the East and the West, there is no desire to look at the CTBT with fresh eyes. In fact, in this context, to frame the CTBT as a CBM for South Asia, I think is fraught with many challenges, and I want to just highlight three of them. Firstly, to frame the CTBT, or in fact any nuclear issue, in the South Asian context that includes only India and Pakistan is neither realistic nor helpful, because South Asian nuclear issues have a triangular dimension. With China's very large nuclear footprint impinging on India's security, very few nuclear CBMs, which have been negotiated in a bilateral context between India and Pakistan, have a chance in today's times. And the problem is that the moment you want to bring China into this dialogue, then China wants Russia and US also into it. So it becomes a global issue rather than remaining only a South Asian construct in any way. The second point I want to make on this is that I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that India and Pakistan already have some of the most forward-looking nuclear and military CBMs that exist between any set of countries with a troubled relationship. Over the last 7 decades, from 1972 onwards, when we had the Shimla Agreement that committed both sides to not forcefully, change borders, remain committed to peaceful coexistence, respect for each other's territorial integrity, sovereignty, all of that, and non-interference in each other's affairs, to the fact that in 1988 we had the non-attack on each other's nuclear facilities. We have a fantastic agreement on the conduct of military exercises that was concluded in 1991. It goes down to the extent of listing that if your troop levels are of a certain kind, how close will you come either to the international border or to the line of control. We've got an agreement on non-intrusion of airspace that was concluded in 1992, the Lahore Memorandum of Understanding, which is very well known to the nuclear watchers. You've got a pre-notification of ballistic missile tests in 2005 and an agreement for reducing risks from accidents relating to nuclear weapons, which was concluded in 2007 and extended in 2012 for another 5 years. So if you look at the panoply of measures that already exists in order to create confidence in this difficult relationship, I don't think what we are wanting is another CBM. Despite the CBMs that already exist, the trust deficit is so high. So obviously there's a problem elsewhere that needs to be addressed. And from the Indian perspective, the problem is much deeper than just the existence or non-existence of CBMs. It's the very nature of the state of Pakistan and its unwillingness to accept that you cannot have a selective approach to terrorism where some are shielded and some are supported in order to carry terrorism as a pursuit of state policy. Lastly, to frame the CTBT as a CBM is essentially meant to reassure the other state that you will not indulge in a certain kind of an activity, in this case, no further testing. As I see it, this is not a major concern between India and Pakistan. Pakistan has always used India as a pretext for carrying out its nuclear activities. So it's unlikely that in an unprovoked atmosphere, Pakistan will undertake further nuclear testing. And India, I don't see India either undertaking nuclear testing to provide that pretext to Pakistan, because in the Indian formulation, the role of the nuclear weapons is deterrence. Deterrence based on punishment. And with a nuclear weapon, given that Hiroshima and Nagasaki used just 15 and 20 kilotons of weapons, and look at the damage that created, which has scarred human mind enough to not use nuclear weapons again. Is it very difficult to cause that kind of a damage with the capability that India has already demonstrated in the 5 tests that it did? So for me, there is no military logic to further nuclear testing, and certainly there's no political logic given that India has been incorporated into the non-proliferation regime with its exceptionalization by the NSG. Rather, I'd argue that given Pakistan's close nuclear proximity to China, the signature that Pakistan puts on the CTBT would not really provide that confidence to India that it would not receive test data from its all-weather friend, even if it was to give up on its own right to nuclear testing. So for me, the CTBT is essentially a global CBM. Ratification of the CTBT is a global issue, and the lead taken by US and China on this to revive the fortunes of the CTBT would have a regional spillover. And it's not just a conditional approach about India doing it only if China and the US was to do it. It's just practical, because the atmospherics changes if some of the major holdouts were to come to the table on the CTBT. Lastly, if I have a minute, I'd like to conclude by offering some other candidates that I think can be there for more effectual CBMs in South Asia. The ambassador also pointed out to what she thinks is a good CBM in her region, and often security perceptions are shaped by where you are. And as far as I am concerned in South Asia, 2 candidates that I think make for effective CBM between India and Pakistan. One is, of course, FMCT. Given that the uncontrolled production of fissile material in a country that is suffering the kind of terrorism that it does would go to address several of the nuclear security concerns that exist not just in India, but fortunately for India, in the rest of the world today. This used to be just a very India problem for a long period of time. The good news is that it's become a global problem today, and there are international security concerns that arise from this uncontrolled fissile material production. And the second candidate, I think, for a good CBM would be Pakistan's signature to the CPPNM Amendment 2005, which allows for nuclear security on domestic transport of nuclear material. And of course, the other one would be its signature to the ICSANT, the International Convention on Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism, which would go much further to provide that reassurance and confidence to countries within the region and beyond. So while I do appreciate the concern of the European Union and their initiative to foster confidence in South Asia, the tools will have to be rather carefully chosen for them to find attraction within the countries in South Asia. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Manpreet. So we do understand that you are not a huge fan of the CBT as a CBM in South Asia. You insisted on the fact where somehow that the CTBT has its very discriminatory character, and you focused on the triangular dimension of security in South Asia, involving, of course, the United States. And on the contrary, Ambassador Al-Mullah insisted on the necessity to delink nuclear issues. You insisted on the question of conditionality, and maybe in an unexpected way, you talked about, in the session, you talked about the relevance of the safety conventions as a more salient instrument on CBMs. And Bill Porter gave us very specific insights on the prospects of ratification by Israel and on the JCPOA as being a possible game changer in the region, and how the Iranian arguments against ratification of the CTBT could be reversed. Maybe Ambassador Soltanieh, you will want to react on that. And finally, but not least, and this is linked with your different points on the CTBT, Bill Porter focused on the possible linkage of the CTBT ratification and India's membership in the NSG, which is also a question to be raised in our discussion. So you have many topics and subtopics on the CTBT in those two regions. So I'm sorry, we have we have time for an important conversation and debate on this, since we have something like 40 minutes. Okay, so you have the floor. Who wants to begin? So many. Pierre, please. Is there a microphone somewhere?
There's one coming.
It arrives. Pierre Goldschmidt.
Sorry, couldn't see you with it.
Yes, well, I think all the points which were made are excellent and very convincing. I will address my question to Dr. Sethi. You said that in the end, India will not be the state who would obstruct the coming into force of the CTBT. One thing. The other thing you said, the CTBT is a global CBM. Now, of course, we understand the US must lead by example and has to ratify the CTBT. It's long overdue. If the US does so, it's likely that China would be the only nuclear weapon states not to ratify it. So the pressure on China would be great, which would be one element favorable also, I think, to India. In the Middle East, it was explained that Israel, Iran, Egypt might be the next candidates. So in the end, one state will remain outside. It's the DPRK. And my question is it possible that since all the other states having to ratify the CTBT in order for the CTBT to enter into force could agree that it will enter into force without DPRK? Is that something possible? Thank you.
We'll take maybe two other ones. First, sir, and then you.
Okay, thank you. I want first to note something important here for the assistant is that the CTBT first, I think the initiator country was the Americans to conclude this CTBT, and the aim was to prevent Pakistan to have the atomic bomb. And when the Americans realized that Pakistan has atomic bomb, the Americans, abstain from concluding the CTBT. That's the first setback, This is for the CTBT. For myself, CTBT is outdated, is anachronic, has nothing to do with preventing atomic weapons. I will explain you. As concerning your proposal here, the CTBT as a regional CBM, I don't think that it's a technical, scientific issue, because as you know, we don't need testing atomic bombs to have nuclear weapons. Because as you know, during the bombing of Japan, there is one bomb was tested, and the other one was not tested, As for Israel had never stated officially that it has, exploded a nuclear device. Unless we take into consideration the flash of the Russian satellite when they said in 1979 that South Africa and Israel had, has operated just over the south of in the large of the Cape Town. I don't think that the CBM can be a good idea, to strengthen the relationship, because the problem here in Middle East, but also in South Asia, the problem is more complicated. It's geopolitical, As you know, it's very difficult to recognize Israel, and Israel has, I think, doesn't need to explode the nuclear device to have nuclear weapons. For South Asia, Pakistan and India, for Pakistan, the only guarantee, the only survival is the atomic bombs. The problem is different for India, you understand? So for myself, this proposal, CBM as a regional CBM, I think is irrelevant, is outdated. Thank you.
Okay, so I guess this was a remark more than a question, but maybe there is a question still on the relevance of nuclear testing. Okay, so maybe this is a question as well. Sir, please, can you present yourself?
Yeah, I am Mohammed Suleiman. Hello, I am Mohammed Suleiman, Research Associate at Center for Pakistan and Gulf Studies at Islamabad, Pakistan. My question is to Dr. Manpreet Sethi. Dr. Saab, as you saying that India do not need to sign the CTBT, but a few years back, one of the Indian nuclear scientists claimed that the 1998 nuclear test of the India could not produce the required result. So, if the Indian nuclear test could not produce the required results, then how can you say that you do not need to sign the CTBT? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will ask the panel first to answer this first wave of questions, and then Emmanuel will have the floor. Please, Manpreet first.
Thank you. I already have a full plate, and I want to start by referring to the question of NSG in India and whether it's a viable proposition to have CTBT as one of the levers to get India into the NSG. Now, I think India believes, and I'm speaking as one Indian viewpoint. It's not India speaking. It's just one viewpoint from the country. India believes that it has a case to be a member of the NSG on its own merit, and I would just put across just two propositions why I think it's a meritorious case. Firstly, the non-proliferation credentials, the activity, the behavior, the restraint on even the nuclear arsenal building that the country has shown, the concept of nuclear deterrence, the newness of the doctrine that it brings to the table is one aspect of how India has the credentials to be a member of the NSG as a responsible player. And the other is that it is a supplier, it has the nuclear technology to be a supplier of some significance. In fact, according to a report that has recently been produced within the country, India already produces 24 types of nuclear components. It has an indigenous program going up to 700 megawatts of nuclear reactors. So you can understand the expertise that it already has to emerge as a nuclear supplier. Compared to that, several of the European countries, I would submit, are not producing as many types of nuclear equipment that makes the case for them to be a member of the nuclear suppliers group. Now, if all that the NSG membership demands, whether of India or of Pakistan, to be a CTBT member, you started by saying it's really a non-issue because none of the countries are in any mood to do any further nuclear testing. You would be shortchanging yourself by just asking for a CTBT membership to become a member of the NSG. And I had the same issue with Mr. Goldsmith when he had laid down the criteria-based approach in which membership of the CTBT, in order to mainstream Pakistan, I think it's really shortchanging the international security environment by asking for just as little as that. Sir, to your question about if the DPRK is out and would we be able to, I think the atmospherics completely changes once you've got US, China and some of the other major holdouts into the treaty, and it's perfectly possible that without waiting for the DPRK to come to the CTBT, it might be possible to change those rules and have the treaty enter into force. Of course, it would also put far greater pressure on the DPRK, and they might be willing to come to the table and ask for some goodies in return for their mainstreaming at some point. So the relevance of nuclear testing, you're very right in suggesting that countries don't have to demonstrate that, but then since nuclear deterrence is all about suggesting to the other side that you don't use because I've got a capability that will be able to harm you much more than the benefit that you get out of that, it's actually testing that is the most effective part of showing that demonstration. So therefore testing, I think, does remain relevant. And to the last question on the whether the nuclear test was a fizzle or not. Now, there was a very, I would say, serious debate within the country, and there were two sets of nuclear scientists, one from a certain section who claimed that the Indian nuclear test had not performed to performance, and there was a section from the Department of Atomic Energy, the official viewpoint, which said that the test had performed perfectly. Now, my point is, deterrence is not dependent on the fact that whether you were able to produce 45 KT, which was claimed, or it was 40, or perhaps even 25. Because given the density of populations in the region where we live, even a 15 or a 20 kiloton weapon should be unacceptable to any rational leadership. So therefore, irrespective of the fact that you might, can Pakistan afford to take a chance by thinking that the weapon will not produce the yield that India had claimed that it would? Is it worth taking a chance on that? So therefore, the testing issue, I think, is a non-issue as far as India is concerned, given the kind of approach that it takes to deterrence. It's not a war-fighting weapon. We are not interested in doing 2 tactical nuclear weapons from this side and 4 from the other side. And if it's going to cause unacceptable damage, it's not very difficult to do it with nuclear weapons, even if they've not performed to whatever was claimed.
Ambassador Al-Mullah and Dr. Potter.
I'm at loss. I'm at loss because there are some who argue there are some treaties that are more important than others. The NPT, the test ban, and whatnot. Listening to our own discussion among the three of us, and the question of the NSG comes up, I'm more convinced that these innocuous, even the test ban treaty that is not so important, you don't have to test to be nuclearly verifiable, whatever. Even these conventions are extremely important. They remain pillars for a world free of nuclear weapons, whether you need to test or not. The NPT still remains a very valid one. The the Safety Convention still remains a very important one. And that is why I always say if it is a little bit difficult for countries to accede or ratify a certain instrument, maybe they can do it in an incremental value. If we demand of every country, like India that had reached a certain level or whatnot. Okay, I demand that the ones higher up should have the same kind of roadmap. We will end nowhere. We will always be digging down, the grounds that we are standing on. If I am going to say, if you qualify for the NSG, I would say, perhaps why not Israel, Israel has a very good record in not being a proliferator. And I come from a region where I will not like to see Israel being an SG. The same thing goes for India. What kind of message does this give to the rest of the world community? It's okay. You do not have to be an NPT party. You don't have to be party to the CTBT, but you are most welcome in the NSG. It's the perceptions. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but we're dealing with perceptions of the world public. What does it do for them? You lose faith. You really lose faith there. And what we are trying to do, I'm saying that not only as a responsible person, not a government, I don't speak for my government, but for the rest of the world. Why do we have all this list of treaties at the UN? Say, okay, fine, to have a good record, it's how many you have signed and ratified, whether it is relevant or not, And you'll have to wait until you reach a certain stage of technical know-how and expertise and whatnot, and then you demand that, okay, the others will have to disarm. It's not a logic for others to go by. I think India and the rest of the region, India, Iran, Israel, Egypt, all of these eyes, I always say beware of the eyes, not to include Italy in them, but I used to include Iraq as well. But, if these countries don't become an example for the others, where are we going? Why are we here? Really, why are we here? Confidence building, but start incremental way. Today we were discussing in the morning, that you'll have to look at it not piecemeal, but, incremental in a way that you'll go ahead. That's why I, not shyly, but I really meant it. Is there any obstacle for India or Pakistan to have stations there? I think it will do the convention a lot of boost, Iran will have to speed up. It's been a long time. You have been promising the organization to do that as well. Incremental value. Iran to pay their dues. You're always late in paying your dues, even to the OPEC fund. A little bit of money, going there. But this incremental value that will boost the faith in non-proliferation. Sorry, I had to mention that, Sorry. But also on another point, also Bill was mentioning the being part of this treaty, of course, allows you to sit there at the table, And I promise I'll come back to you in a brief note. And we did try that for the membership of the Governing Council. We tried that informally in 2003. To meet in separate subgroups, but it didn't fly. Unfortunately, I don't know what went wrong. I think you have a better access to information than myself. It could be tried again. Thank you.
I'll only make two brief remarks at the moment because the questions really weren't directed at my presentation. But I do think I would kind of echo and amplify on Ambassador Almullah's defense of the importance of the CTBT, and I'm kind of taken aback by the notion that it's no longer a relevant treaty, which I think is really very misplaced and unfortunate. And I think it's not only a question of preventing testing by states that may not yet be party to the treaty. There's also the risk that states that have ratified the treaty could backtrack. And so I think it's absolutely crucial to erect as many barriers as possible to make it much more politically costly for any country to seriously contemplate nuclear testing today. And it has nothing to do with the importance of the CTBT also for the NPT. I think the only other point I'd make here, and I have to restrain myself because I have very strong and fairly well-known views about the self-inflicted punishment that we've brought about by granting an exemption to India for the NSG in the first place. A country that is not only a nuclear weapons possessor, not a party to the NPT, one action which I think devalues the benefits of being a non-nuclear weapon state party to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And to go beyond that to actually grant membership in addition to having granted this exemption without getting anything in return, I think is simply most unfortunate. And I'm shocked by the number of countries which have this collective amnesia in terms of obligations which they undertook beginning in 1995, reiterated in 2000, not to mention all kinds of legally binding restraints in the form of nuclear weapons-free zones by parties that also seem to look the other way. But rather than say more, I think I'll pause and wait to hear from Ali Sultani and others who may address specific points that I raised in my presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Patawi. I'll take a second round of questions. Starting by Emmanuel Maître here, then Ambassador Sultanier.
And there is the lady there.
Then you and the lady. And after we'll see. Thanks.
Emmanuel Maître, Fondation pour la Recherche Stratégique. Mrs. Methi, I listen with great interest to your argument according to which testing is not really relevant for the Indian deterrence posture. I was wondering if this view was well accepted by the Indian scientific community, first. And second, as testing is not always a technical matter but also political, how strong is actually the moratorium on testing in both Pakistan and India, given the tensions between the two countries? Thank you.
Thank you very much. William, you provoked me to speak. A couple of points. First of all, I appreciate very important deliberations by the panelists. Regarding CTBT, I think that we have, in these kind of intellectual gatherings, we should have a very clear, candid approach. NPT is the most discriminatory treaty, but the state of the fact is that we are party to NPT, and that's the only way that we can do it. At the same time, we should not lose sight of the fact that we have not done anything regarding Convention on Nuclear Weapons, and this is very, very bad. And we have to blame all of us that have been working 40, 30 years. We have not done really tangible work in CD in Geneva when I was there. We have not done it, and now they're taking FMCT, and they're just forgetting the main concern about nuclear weapon convention. Regarding CTBT, I said it in Vienna 7 years. I was following it as a representative to CTBT. Believe that CTBT is not as it is portrayed, because as it was clearly said, still simulations, subcritical, critical could be done. Therefore, we should be worried about modernization without CTBT, even if CTBT is entered into force today. Therefore, this is the reality. Now, having said so, we have been committed to, we are signatory, and we are very active in Vienna. Regarding stations, we have not done anything contrary to the CTBT, because the stations could be operational when it's entered into force. No rush. And bearing in mind the existing stations, the Secretariat is fulfilling its mandate, even, of course, preliminary mandate, because there's no mandate yet. But they have done the work without any problem. Therefore, this is nothing that you can make it an issue that without the stations in Iran not working, then the whole system is not working. This is not true. Regarding the NSG and these kind of things also, again, we do respect for Indians expecting to join the NSG or whatever. But what happened regarding nuclear cooperation between U.S. and India, was a serious setback because they totally ignored the fact that, this is a double standard. The countries which do not have a nuclear weapon and like Iran, they are paying the price of being party to NPT for 12 years. But at the same time, there is cooperation, and then the NSG. And of course, you know what happened in the NSG meeting. There are a lot of the problems. And of course, if the India goes, fair enough, Pakistan will go also expect to be NSG and these kind of things. Therefore, what's going on in the, we see it is all double standards, no principle. U.S. make a decision to go with India, and then France, others join, and then let's go it. And as if we are talking, I don't know what you're talking about, all these obligations, treaties, universality also. This is something that hurts my feeling after years following this matter. With due respect, as I said. But at the same time, when I was in all years in Vienna, I always appreciated that India said from the beginning, we have not joined NPT because it's discriminatory. Okay, this mentality is something that we have to respect. I want to go to the nuclear safety. When Chernobyl occurred, and Dr. Hans Prinz is here, very respectful friend, he was, in fact, initiative that meeting for 2 conventions on nuclear safety, early notification and mutual assistance, and I was fully in charge from A to Z. And we had a successful meeting. Finally, immediately we ratified it. Also, we are party to that nuclear safety. But there, I remember, and this is part of the history, U.S. and Soviet Union raised their hand. They said that we should be exempted because we are nuclear weapon state. We cannot give information, confidential information about our nuclear facilities, even nuclear accidents. And I was the only one to the last moment to oppose them because we cannot accept any discriminatory treaty. And I'm happy that finally they had to comply, and then we were sitting, writing together that article. Now, regarding Middle East and all the topic of CBM, I have always said here and there a positive gesture by Pakistan and India for non-attack. I really commend you. And I've used this idea in Athens Dialogue 4 years ago and last week in Nagasaki, and I'm saying here today. Although the Middle East free zone, which have been our ultimate goal and interest, and Iran is the first proponent, and we know what has happened since 2010 onward, I don't want to repeat, which is regretful. But I felt that there is a possibility of a confidence-building measure which is possible towards that ultimate goal, that all in the Middle East commit not to attack nuclear installations, the same as Pakistan and India. This at least gives a confidence building that increase to some extent security, that they would not be jeopardizing or threaten our security. That is my idea, proposal of a CBM on non-attack in Middle East. I think that could work. And regarding this convention of nuclear safety that Ambassador Mola said, I just want to say it is a pipeline. Don't make it an issue because we are very concerned about nuclear safety ourselves. And for the region, I've been involved inviting all the countries in the region to visit Butcher Power Plant. And from the beginning, you know that we have a big project with the IEA from years ago, even during the operation and commissioning, that the IEA has brought top experts. And after they confirmed, we started. And even we implemented many safeties, and we paid more money on time in order to implement all safety factors. Therefore, this is nothing to worry. But soon you will see that we will join that convention. But don't make it, my advice is nobody should make it any political issue. The last point, why we are not joining the CTBT. I'm afraid, I'm sorry. But this is a couple of questions were there. Before this issue of nuclear issue started, I remember we were talking to our parliamentarian to pave the way for ratification. But now, paying the price of NPT for the years, please be realistic. Don't expect that after this agreement, immediately we can go to the parliament and say, now, let's ratify the CTBT. But of course, depending on implementation and seeing the positive fruits of this cooperation and putting aside those problems over the last 12 years, then I think that ultimately we will ratify because we are committed not to do it. And we encourage everybody else. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. May we add to your CBM on non-attack on nuclear installations, provided the installation is under safeguards for and non-nuclear weapon states? Of course.
I think that is an important point because I proposed the resolution. I proposed the resolution 533 in IAEA in 1990 again when Hans was there, and that was one great achievement. And I had a problem with India, let me tell you there, because I proposed a resolution from A to Z and it was adopted, but India was not in agreement with me because of this, exactly what you said. He said, you change this paragraph to say that it will cover all its installations, not only the so-called peaceful under safeguard, but anyway, finally, that resolution, our resolution, passed away. But in NPT and 2010, there was a consensus that I proposed, consensus that all should be protected, of course, peaceful nuclear installations. Thank you.
Okay, we have your point. Then, sir here and the lady on the back of the room and two gentlemen there, and we will finish with the questions because we will just have 10 minutes then. Thank you very much. Please make it brief and possibly a question rather than a report.
Definitely a question. Thank you. Bijan Toulabi, Free University Amsterdam in Dutch Parkwash. I'd like to return to one of the very first questions that was posed by the gentleman in the front. I'm sorry, your name escapes me right now. About whether it's possible to enter into force the CTBT if everyone ratifies it except for the DPRK. And I think that Dr. Sethi answered in the affirmative. Just a bit of legal nitpicking. I tried to go over the treaty text itself. It's incredibly long, so I couldn't find it. But if I remember it correctly, the amendment clause says that the treaty has to enter into force before you can amend it. So I don't really see how this is possible in a legal way. Now, if you propose some kind of political solution to this so that we consider it to be entered into force, while officially, legally it's not. But I'd like your comments on this, how this could work if DPRK doesn't actually ratify it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Kelsey Davenport with the Arms Control Association. Absent entry into force of the CTBT, some supporters have suggested pursuing a UN Security Council resolution that would reinforce the treaty by determining that any nuclear testing would be a threat to international peace and security. I would just be interested in the panel's views about whether or not that would indeed support CTBT efforts or if it's redundant. Thank you.
Sir, please.
Okay, I am Khalid Jamali from Pakistan Embassy. I just wanted to respond to some of the points that Ms. Sethi has raised, and I would not have let it go like this. First of all, she mentioned about the Pakistan's brinkmanship. But let me tell you, we were not the first ones to have introduced nuclear weapons in South Asia. And we have always voted for CTBT, and we do it regularly in the UNGA every year. And we are also following a unilateral moratorium on the nuclear testing. One. Secondly, she also mentioned about the terrorism. Pakistan is one country which has sacrificed a lot, and we have given about more than 70,000 lives in war on terror, and it has been recognized by both the West and the EU also. And I just wanted to put it on the record. Thank you.
And the last one.
Thank you. Brief points, I cannot elaborate on them, but the first question would be what happened to the resolution 1172 of the UN Security Council of 1989. So technically it's still in place, and it prohibits testing and other nuclear weapons related activities for India and Pakistan. Secondly, very briefly, we do have, of course, we know the initiative for Middle East weapon-free zone failed, but we do have nuclear weapon-free zones in the north of the Middle East and in the south. We do have Semipalatinsk and we do have Belindava. Both include prohibition of nuclear tests, but also in the protocol they have negative security assurances. So it might be possible to extend the norms of these nuclear weapon-free zones to the south and to the north. So you get a test ban in exchange for negative security assurances. So.
Thank you very much. So we will begin by you, Dr. Potter, then you, Dr. Sethi, and we will finish the session by you and Mrs. Ambassador. Please.
Thanks. Let me respond to Kelsey's question and just make one comment, a way of kind of summary here. I'm familiar with the discussions that involve a number of states parties and also NGOs to try to promote a UN Security Council resolution along the lines that you've suggested. And I think in many respects, one can make in many respects, it's a compelling approach, which would probably marshal very considerable international support. I think there are two potential problems. The more serious one is whether or not such an initiative by an international body will help or hinder ultimate U.S. Senate ratification of the treaty. And while I have absolutely zero confidence that the current Senate would ratify any treaty, I mean, were the U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights to be, put forward, I'm sure it would be defeated. So I don't anticipate anytime soon ratification of the CTBT, but I do worry a little bit that you might be providing additional ammunition for those parties who, might otherwise be more responsive to ratification, particularly where it's possible, as I suggested, that Israel might move forward. And I'm a little bit surprised that what I thought was a provocative statement with respect to Israel has generated not a single question. So I'm glad you all share my view that Israel is on the, the cusp of ratification. The second potential difficulty, and here there are others around the room who can speak to this better than I, NAM in the past, I think collectively, but certainly many NAM members and other non-nuclear weapon states have been reluctant to see the UN Security Council act in a fashion that might be regarded as a kind of legislating body. And so I'd be quite curious to see how the current chair of NAM would regard this kind of an initiative. It doesn't mean it's good or bad, but there are problems just from the approach. The last thing that I would make by way of a suggestion, and there are a number of people who've made this recently, including Bob Einhorn, and that is the idea that perhaps one might contemplate something short of a comprehensive test ban treaty, but one that would focus specifically on banning tests in the Middle East, whether as a confidence-building measure or as one senior Egyptian official who happened to also be here, but in a prior incarnation suggested that one could think of such a test ban in the region as a technical requisite, I think those were his words, for a WMD-free zone. And I think it merits some consideration today. Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Sati, please.
Thank you very much. I want to start by the point that came up when the ambassador said that the CTBT is a pillar of the non-proliferation regime, and I won't agree. I mean, I cannot but agree with you more on this subject, which also ties in with the question that came up: is the CTBT redundant and irrelevant? I don't think it is. The CTBT is a very important building block of the non-proliferation regime. India has always advocated that treaties like the NPT, the CTBT, the FMCT are all little building blocks that are eventually to lead you to a nuclear weapons-free world. But unfortunately, the manner in which the NPT has been crafted, the CTBT has come about, you don't see them as leading to that nuclear weapons-free world. But yes, they remain by themselves important non-proliferation measures in order to ensure where you don't want a world where everybody has nuclear weapons. Kenneth Waltz might have said more is better, but I think I always give the example of the Indian road, and those of you who've been in India understand that when you are on a busy road like that, it's not just my control over my vehicle that's important. It's also the other person's control over his vehicle that's extremely important. And the more we are in a proliferated world, the more are the problems of that kind that come up. So certainly there is a role for the CTBT to play in the non-proliferation regime. There's no doubt about that. It's just that it is not the topmost priority as far as India is concerned in terms of the international security architecture at this moment in time, which is why, your point, ma'am, about why should India not be a part of the International Monitoring Station network. I did mention that there is a domestic baggage to the CTBT. And when India had rejected ratification, acceptance of the CTBT in 1996, there was a unanimous resolution that was passed in the parliament saying that India will not be a member of the CTBT. So in today's times, for a political leader or a government to bring the CTBT debate back into the domestic narrative needs, one, his conviction that it's worthwhile to go down that route, two, his political clout and the ability to take the opposition along. And those of you who study India know what a vociferous, voluble democracy that this country is. And thirdly, you would need a trigger event which will change the atmospherics for us to go down that route. So therefore, a possibility of an American or a Chinese ratification of the CTBT will tend to create that trigger for India to change its stance on the CTBT. But there's a huge amount of domestic aspect to the ratification of the CTBT that must be understood for us to understand why those kinds, what is being made out as a simple step of getting to be a part of the International Monitoring Station network doesn't look like a possibility in today's times. The message that the message that goes out to the world if India was to be given the NSG membership, I think the message that we should all be crafting that should go out to the world is that you can reward responsible behavior. The NPT is a treaty that was made at a particular time to suit the environment at that time. It's not a treaty that's cast in stone that cannot be changed, but it set an artificial date as dividing a country from being a nuclear weapon state to a non-nuclear weapon state. Circumstances have changed. India's security concerns were not addressed by the NPT, and therefore it has never been a part of the treaty and its obligations. Despite not being a member of the NPT, it has maintained a perfect record on non-proliferation, better than many of the members of the NPT. So therefore, the message that should go out, if India was to be accommodated into the NSG, should be that you can make exceptions for countries that have shown exceptional behavior on non-proliferation. In fact, by keeping it out and talking about mainstreaming some of the other countries, it's exactly the opposite message that goes out, that you can reward bad behavior, but you will, sanction good behavior. India did not get anything in return. The world did not get anything in return for India's NSG exceptionalization. I have serious issue with that. I think India did accept to formulate the separation plan to put nearly 80% of its then indigenous reactor capability under IAEA safeguards, because it was under no obligation to have IAEA safeguards on any of its indigenously developed nuclear capability. Therefore, being dismissive of what India offered to be a part of the non-proliferation regime, I think is actually a disservice to some of the future actions that India could take. Because if now it's being said that the separation plan was no big deal, it doesn't matter that India put so many reactors under IAEA safeguards, signed up to an additional protocol, all of that is useless, then today if you were to sign the CTBT, even that would be dismissed in the future, to say, well, that was something that doesn't matter. Testing issue that Emmanuel, you raised about the scientific community. I don't think the scientific community has much of a voice in making that decision on whether future testing is going to take place or not, because it is going to be a political decision, and you don't see any voices, any writing coming out from the scientific community that tends to suggest that India would be interested in any further testing as of now. How strong is the moratorium in India and Pakistan? I think it is very strong. In both the countries, I don't see any arguments being made that you need to do further testing for the purpose of deterrence as it exists today. UNSC 1172, sir, like many other UN Security Council resolutions, it's been overtaken by circumstances, and I think times today are quite different. It is in place, yes. On paper, it remains very much there. I think I will stop here.
Thank you very much. Just a word. Would you make a difference between signature and ratification? Don't think I'm trying to sell the carpet, but oh, sorry. I'm not trying to sell a carpet, but still, signature is something which is different from ratification, but it is something. What about that? I mean, it's part of the debate also.
And there are legal obligations, even when you sign.
Absolutely. Just on that, sorry, Ambassador, it was just one point. If can she answer? Please, thank you, and then we'll.
Technically, in the in the Indian parliamentary system, there is no distinction between signature and ratification, because once the government has committed to that, it need not be ratified through the parliament. But seeing how the world is developing on many of these issues, and that they do continue to make that distinction between signature and ratification, I think India is also going along those lines to say that even if you were to sign but not ratify immediately, you might still be carrying a certain leverage with you, to provide ratification at a later date. But technically, in the past, we've never had treaties had to be ratified in the parliament for them to be, legally effective for the country.
Okay. But just one point on that. Ambassador, you will close our session, please.
I just wanted to relate a small anecdote. I mean, Kuwait is a small country. We don't have the basis, of nuclear technology of Iran and India, let alone any one other area. We know our own size. But I'll just refer to an incident whereby we were one of the first stations to take samples because with the Chernobyl before our own station was certified by the organization. We sent samples from Kuwait, from the Qusr Scientific Center, that showed that the particles were already all the way down in the Gulf region. What I'm saying is that we can cooperate together. Not everything needs to be ratification with a seal and to wait for legal framework and things. And that is why I went shyly to the incremental value, and that is the stations. And if the stations are difficult to establish in the subcontinent, I don't know, perhaps it is a dead-end street to go through, this CTBT. But let's hope, as Will mentioned earlier, I hope that Israel will be the next one, or others, Israel and Egypt, why not? That will be a good landmark for the CTBT. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. We will close with this optimistic and, your hope. The session is over. This was very stimulating and we needed it after lunch. So thank you very much to all of you.